Welcome to another episode of Game Changers for Government Contractors. I'm your host, Michael Lejeune, and today we have a recurring guest, Mr. Stephen Coprince. Not only is he a whiz in the legal field, but I hear you're a mean pickleball champ as well.
Mediocrity is the name of the game with the pickleball, Michael. But I
Is it?
appreciate that, and I'm gonna go with your description instead of mine from now
I had
on.
I had to throw that out there. Since you got into pickleball, like I'd never really heard of it till you got into it, and then my daughter's into it now, and we played on our last vacation in Florida, and I'm like, okay, I see a little bit of the hype. I get it. It seems fun, so now I got to bring it up all the time. But you
It's
know,
fun. It's fun. Those of you out there who haven't tried it yet, give it a try. It's
give
it's
it a try.
surprisingly addictive. It looks a little silly, like wiffle ball and stuff, but it's a lot of fun and easy to pick up. It's easy to learn, difficult to master. It's one of those types.
There you go. There you go. That's a good way to put it. We're going to be talking today about some of the proposed changes, depending on when this comes out. It could be actual changes here, but some of the proposed changes that the government's looking at that you don't necessarily agree with, and I don't necessarily agree with all of them. But this podcast got spurred by an article that someone wrote about some of the proposed changes and just kind of what our thoughts and opinions were on it. And I thought it would be good to hop on here and have two grown-ups have a good discussion here, whether we agree or disagree on points, but just a respectful, kind of dialogue about what's going on. Because I have my views, you have your views on some of the things. And I just thought I'd let you kick off by kind of talking about what some of the changes are that you think are going to impact small business over the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Michael, thank you so much for having me. Always wonderful to chat with you. And I love that we have this sort of relationship where we can be like, let's have a respectful disagreement in some areas, I'm sure agreement in others. And, we're going to leave it still respecting each other and our points of view. And I think that's the best way to approach some of these things because there are multiple points of view and that it's not that necessarily one is valid and the other is invalid. It's that people approach it from different places and different opinions. So let's get into it. This is obviously 2025. For those of you who've been in government contracting for any length of time, this is a really impactful year in terms of the regulatory and statutory landscape. We've got this revolutionary FAR overhaul process going on where we're rewriting the entire FAR. That's ongoing as you and I are talking right now. And then separately, and what we kind of are probably going to be focused on here today, are some changes that the Revolutionary Fire Overhaul folks, which is the Fire Council, OMB, the people who draft the regulations, are not able to make unilaterally because they're a matter of statute. And statute, of course, is what Congress passes into law. President usually signs that. It's the old Bill on the Hill thing. And so some of the things that maybe that RFO process that those folks would like to accomplish, they can't do it unless Congress agrees and changes the underlying statute because it's a fundamental principle that an unelected regulatory official cannot write a regulation that contradicts statute, what the elected representatives of Congress have written. So what's happened is the GSA, along with OMB, have presented to Congress a list of 16 proposals, 16 legislative proposals that they would like Congress to enact. And this is saying, these are the things that we would do if we were in your shoes, Congress. Would you please do those for us? And some of these are going to impact small businesses. And for better or worse is maybe where we can get into the discussion there.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about the way that a couple of these proposals were presented is that you really have to get beyond what GSA has put in kind of their summary sheet and go to the actual proposed red lines to the statutes themselves to see what's going to happen to small business. I don't know if they've really been as upfront in their summary as they probably could have been with respect to what this is going to mean for small business. So let's focus on the two that together I think are going to really impact small business. To get there, we sort of have to know what the FAR already says. And so and what the statute already says. So this can get a little complicated. I'm just talking, but feel free to interrupt me.
No, this is perfect. I think a lot of people need to understand where we are today and what the proposed rule would do, and then we can kind of debate from there.
Absolutely. So let's talk about where things stand right now. For small businesses, the cornerstone of small businesses doing business with the federal government for decades has been small business set-aside contracts. Now, obviously, small businesses win contracts that are unrestricted. They go toe-to-toe with big companies and win sometimes. That's a thing. That happens. But a lot of the business that small businesses get from federal government contracting is based on small business set-asides. And small business set-asides are part of FAR 19.502-2. FAR 19.502-2, if we're following the bouncing ball here, has two pieces. It has a Part A and a Part B. And Part A says, government contracting officer, if you have an acquisition that's valued between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, that the default for that is it's going to be a small business set aside. It's going to be a small business set aside so long as you have a reasonable expectation of having two or more qualified, capable offers who are going to submit at fair market prices. I mean, that's a summary essentially of what that says. FAR 19.502-2A. Part of these the so-called rule of two is a matter of statute. That is in federal statute, where it says between the MPT and the SAT, you essentially must do this rule of two analysis. The RFO folks could not eliminate that or change it if they wanted to without Congress's approval. Above the rule of simplified acquisition threshold, what the FAR currently says is something that's essentially the same. It essentially applies a rule of two. It's a little bit less strict than that, but there's a rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold as well. And that is actually not required by statute. That is the FAR Council did that on its own volition under its broader authority to adopt a rule or rules that the congressional command there is broader. It is ensure that small businesses receive a fair proportion of federal contracting dollars. And so what the FAR Council did is it took a look at that, at what it could do to drive that fair proportion, and said, let's essentially apply a rule of two above the SAT as well. What has that meant for small businesses? Well, it has meant that in recent years, the government has met and exceeded the 23% goal. Last year, it has a 23% goal for prime contracting dollars to small businesses. In recent years, it's been kind of 25 to 27, 28%. Which, by the way, still means that large businesses are getting more than 70% of prime contracting dollars, or other than small businesses, if we want to not forget our mid-tier folks out there. So what does GSA's legislative proposal do that now impacts this? Well, it squeezes the statutory command. Remember, the statutory command is between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds. As we sit here today talking, this is going to change actually soon. The micro purchase threshold is $10,000. Generally speaking, the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. There's going to be some inflationary adjustments that happen effective October 1st that will actually raise the SAT to $350,000. So the statute says between those two numbers, you generally must do a small business set aside. GSA's proposal is first, over a 5-year period, increase the micro purchase threshold to $100,000. And they say that's, we're going to do this in the interest of efficiency. And I think there's not, a valid argument to be had for that. But that does mean that now between 10,000, if this were to happen, between the 10,000 and 100,000 mark, that's a range of $90,000, we no longer have a small business rule of two mandate. The government can go out using the purchase card or whatever and simply buy as it would an ordinary micro purchase. Then the GSA proposal to Congress says we're going to increase the simplified acquisition threshold in the same period to $10 million. And so if you just read that, and this is in the GSA summary, and you know how FAR 19.5022 works and that statutory command that says between those two thresholds, you must do a small business set aside, you're probably cheering and be like, wow, they're going to expand that range from between 10,000 and 250 to between 100,000 and 10 million. That's fantastic. I really want that. But when you go into the actual red lines that the GSA proposed to Congress of this current statute, GSA has eliminated the part of the statute that says between the micro purchase and simplified acquisition thresholds, crossed out simplified acquisition threshold and wrote in $250,000, which is the current simplified acquisition threshold. So instead of the mandate for the small business rule of two keeping pace with the increased SAT, it would actually be frozen at $250,000, which, as you and I are speaking here in mid-September, is the current number for the SAT. But that, as of October 1st, it's going to be $350,000. So it would freeze it actually at an old number. And so now you would have a range for that SAT of just $150,000, between $150 and $100 and $150,000, or $250 would be your range in which this rule of two was required. What happens to the rule of two above the $250,000 mark? I don't know. It's going to depend what the RFO folks would do with it, but theoretically it could be eliminated entirely. We'll have to see how that process plays out. If the statutory command was just between the micro purchase and 250, then you have only $150,000 range in which small business set asides are required. Meanwhile, the simplified acquisition threshold is already increasing, as I said, October 1st to 350. So that's what I don't like about this. That that small businesses, not exclusively, but in large part, rely on these small business set asides to have this fair proportion of federal contracting dollars. You can argue the numbers overall in terms of how the government's doing, but with respect to 23% goal, it's working. That's the current rule of two is working, and I'm very concerned that if we go and monkey with that, that we're going to see small business contracts fall significantly in the years ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting, and the when you look at all the changes over the last, I don't know what, 9 months or so,
Yeah,
there's that's not the only one, right? There's a lot of impact, not only with this, but consolidation of contracts, cancellation of contracts, different things that happened. And my point of view on it is, yes, you can write your Congress people, feel free to write them, but at the end of the day, focus on business development. Focus on business development. Do those things, but we've got to figure out a path forward within the rules that are set, because there's going to be a set of rules that are put in place that the average person probably doesn't have a lot of pull with, right? I even think, like, if you're going to write your congressman, it's best not to write them alone. That would actually be if I was going to write someone in my state, I would try to grab every business owner that I know to sign off on it. Not just me submitting a letter, Mike Lejeune, by myself, right? But hey, can I get 100 people, 100 business owners in the community to sign off? Can I get 10 to sign off on a letter to someone? Because I think that's going to be more effective and get more eyeballs than just by yourself. But at the end of the day, it's like the rules continue to change, and we have to find a way to work within the rules. Like when I look at our clients have a mix of status contracts. And when a lot of people get into this market, they hear, look, all you need, man, just, under the table, all you need is your 8A, and money's going to rain down from the heavens, or your WSB, or your STVSB, or your what, money's going to rain down from the heavens. And then they get the thing, whatever the thing is, and they're like, Mike, we haven't won a single contract with this status, right? It hasn't helped them in a lot of cases, because the government doesn't just say, oh my God, Stephen, you're a small disadvantaged woman-owned 8A, whatever. We just have $10 million sitting here to just give you, right? They don't have that. So they have to build a case. And so, like, for a lot of our clients as well, we make the shift from sam.gov, because a lot of people are out there and their whole business development strategy is searching sam.gov. Like, if that's your whole business strategy, you're missing 80% of the opportunities out there, because only 10 to 20% make it to sam.gov, because the other ones are being done in this realm here, where it's under the micro purchase, under simplified acquisition, is just being done on a purchase card, or being done a sole source method, or it's being done on a contract vehicle or something like that. And if you're not on the pre-acquisition side, you're missing out on all these dollars, because you're just focused on what's on SAM. And SAM has a smaller portion of the opportunity. So focus pre-acquisition, focus on educating and building relationships with people, and that's ultimately how you win contracts. That's our method. Pre-acquisition is where you should spend 80% of your time, and in pre-acquisition, you can talk about some of those statuses and different things like that and help guide them. But ultimately, I found a lot of contracting officers also don't use the set aside. So, like, when we pull historical data and we look at an agency, let's say there's 6 contracting officers in an office, and I filter it down to look at what set asides they're using. The set aside that is most common that I see when I filter data is small business. That's the one.
Sure.
It's small business.
Yep.
And then there's a dramatic gap between small business and whatever the next one is. So whether the next one is STVSB, WSB, 8A, there's usually a massive gap, like an abyss-sized gap between those two things. I pulled some data on a client a while back, and like the small business spend by this one agency was like $900 and something million, and then it dropped to 8A at like 45 million. Like, that was the gap between the two. And so, like, I think there's too much emphasis on I need all these statuses, and not enough emphasis on, so even if you do have a status, how do you position it? Because, like, if I were to look at working with the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and then Department of Justice and all these agencies, when we pull data, we're looking to say, okay, so who in that agency buys what I sell? Then how do they buy it? Are they using contract vehicles? Then we get drilled down into set aside. So which contracting officer is WSB friendly or STVOSB friendly? Because the historical data shows you that. So you can go, oh, they understand 8A and they have done some sole source, or they understand 8A, but they've not done any sole source. To be able to say, okay, how can we actually speak to this contracting officer in a language they understand to get them to hopefully put something out as one of those statuses or do it another way. So that's when I look at it, I was like, okay, I see this could cause some problems. So how do we deal with it? If the government's hell bent on going a direction, how do we then adjust our business development process around this? Is it working more with teams? You know, you mentioned before we got on the podcast about, you know, if a small or medium-sized business is looking at, well, now Amazon can compete at our level. Okay, so now do we work with Amazon? You know, because we're probably not going to beat Amazon. How do we work with Amazon? And then when you look at like the One Gov strategy, which is, you know, pulling all those license deals out and going directly to Microsoft and Amazon and Google and Salesforce and all those people, instead of being able to just sell licenses, now we actually have to put the value add in the VAR, right? We can't just be a reseller. We have to put the value add, and where are we going to do that? So again, for me, it's like, how do we adjust business development strategy to work around this? Because ultimately, I think there's only so much input we're going to have on changing it. I hope, since it's a proposed rule, I hope they clarify the 250 and that was maybe just a placeholder. And maybe it's as it increases, that number will increase. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have to see. You know, Congress will get its shot. I mean, you make a lot of great points. I think for me, it's important for small businesses to know what's going on out there and where the, you know, rules might be heading, just so they can understand what the landscape might look like. I agree that there's only so much an individual small business can do to influence how that turns out. There have been a number of advocacy organizations that have sponsored a bill that was in the Senate now, and there's a companion bill in the House that would codify the rule of two at all dollar values. So that there has been some work out there on that, but there's usually some strength in numbers or with
Mm-hmm.
working with groups who have experience and knowledge in the lobbying field. And you know, there's nothing wrong with reaching out to your member of Congress, as far as I'm concerned, and saying, "Hey, I'm a small business that's your constituent. Here's how this might impact me." But you're absolutely right that you do what little you can to influence what's going on, and then you look at the landscape and say, "Okay, you know, given where we stand now, where we might be going, what does that mean for my business?" You know, and
Yeah.
what kind of competitive intelligence do I need to survive and thrive in this changing marketplace, which we'll have to see how some of these massive changes we're going through this year ultimately shake out. Will Congress adopt GSA's proposals as written? Will they just ignore them, which they're allowed to do, of course? Will they change them in some way? You know, that Congress has every right to do that. The Revolutionary Fire Overhaul process is supposed to be complete in the next couple months. We'll see how that
Yeah.
shakes out. But all that's going to impact kind of some of these questions you're talking about, because folks who have been in this market for a while know that you don't just, you know, this notion that you get an 8A or you get a whatever certification or you get a GSA schedule, then you just sit back on the beach and sip a martini or margarita and
Right.
wait for the contracts to just come raining down. Like, that's not how this stuff
Right.
works. You gotta, even within the 8A world itself, which can be a pretty powerful certification if it's used right. I've worked with plenty of clients who have told me, I got it too early. I got it at the wrong time because it's a 9-year maximum period. It wasn't until year 4 or 5 that I knew what the heck I was doing with it. I
Yeah.
wasted half my time. I wasn't at the right point in my business cycle
Exactly.
to take fully advantage of that cert. So doing that competitive research, understanding your customer, which certifications matter to them, to individual contracting officers, to agencies like the VA has that unique preference for SDVOSBs. That's the vet first preference. So if that's your customer, maybe that certification you need to pursue. And thinking about, hey, if small business set asides, if there are fewer of them moving forward, what would be my strategy? Am I going to go head to head with Amazon and try to beat them? Or am I going to say, hey, no one's proposing to get rid of small business subcontracting plans for large primes. So am I just going to flip to being a sub in some of these cases, instead of trying to prime these things? And bring my knowledge and skills to the table that way. And that may be unappealing for some folks, but not necessarily for others. And there's still ways to get pieces of this market, no matter how it shakes out. It's just knowing what that landscape is, knowing who your customers are, and seeing how that landscape, the evolution of the landscape is going to affect your competitive strategy. And that's where obviously folks like you are going to be there helping people adjust to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I one of the things that I love about your perspective on all the things you write about is you always talk about the facts, what the things are. You always sprinkle in, here's my thoughts, and it always makes sense to me. By the way,
Well,
because
I
you write
appreciate that.
so clear. You write so clear. Like he clearly has a gift for writing, and I love the way you do that. And on the flip side, I do feel like there are a lot of people in the market that tend to look at the sky is falling a lot of times when anything changes. Like when you upset the apple cart in any way, like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, it's horrible. And then you mix in politics where somebody says, well, I hate this administration. Like, guess what? 50% of America hate every administration, right?
Yeah, that's the
At
world
least,
we're living in.
yeah, that's the world we live in. At least 50% of the population hates every administration. It doesn't matter who's in the office or who's in Congress. 50% of America can't stand any of them. And when you look at that and you put that bias in, that's where I look at it and say, okay, stop with the sky is falling and let's tell people how to fix it. Because the one thing that to me, the sky is falling message totally disregards is, especially when it comes to small business, is how innovative small business owners are. They're very innovative at going, okay, here's what the rule was. Here's what the rule is. How are we going to either live within the rule or just skirt it along the gray to
Yeah.
make money? Because I would attribute the 23 to 28% of contracts not to Congress by setting a rule, but to small business owners who have found a way to win the contracts. Because ultimately is them putting their companies in front of people that's turned it into dollars. I mean, it's nice that they've set some money aside, right? That's nice. But it's contractors on the ground making those decisions, and we underestimate how innovative people can be. Because I guarantee you, even if there is a shift and we lose 5,000 contractors next month, we're going to gain 5,000 contractors in some way over the next amount of time. Because there's some people that are looking at it like a gold rush. They're saying, okay, there was a big change. It lost the market. Ooh, there's a gap in this market. People are doing that with CMMC right now where they're like, oh, there's a gap in the market. And if I can be first to market, I can fix this problem. Or if I can just get in the market, I'll get a piece of what's going on. And so I see people making those shifts. And even to your point about subcontracting, I tell a lot of companies, look, you may only be a subcontractor. That may be your fate in this market. But what if you were a subcontractor bringing in $50 million in subcontracts? Is that and they're like, oh my gosh, that'd be amazing. I'm like, yeah, it'd be amazing, right? It's the dollar spins the same way. And oh, by the way, you have less overhead because you're not writing all the proposals. You're not responsible for the program management. There's all these things you're not responsible for. So if you look at it and say, well, how do we create a business model that functions in this environment? Like, you will be successful. And that's what I see, given how, again, the American small business owner runs things today. They're very, very innovative, and they do things that I would have never thought about sometimes. So that's where I'm optimistic about the changes. I'm hopeful that there will be more clarity around those changes that you're talking about, because they are proposed, right? They're not final. And hopefully when it comes out, we'll be like, okay, I'm a little pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised with CMMC. I had heard the rumor that they were going to get rid of the level 2 self-certification. Like, hey, they're going to get rid of that. They're going to get rid of that. We talked about 4 years. They're going to get rid of it. And it drops. And lo and behold, they didn't, right? You can still self-certify at level 2 in some cases. So I think we can be pleasantly surprised. We may not be. It may be worse than what we think. Who knows? But then it's like life goes on, and some people will leave the market and they'll just go do other things. And it's like, but other people will be creative and find a way. So is it?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, anything else you want to add to that? I mean, I want to give you the final word on this, or if there's any other changes that you see that, like, you know what, we've talked about those to death, but there's this one other little looming thing in the closet that we haven't.
Yeah, well, and I think to your point, I mean, absolutely. I'm a small business advocate. I've been a small business owner myself. I've worked with hundreds, probably over 1,000 small businesses in my career. Yeah, I mean, they're innovative, they're tenacious, they're wily. They're going to
Yeah.
find a way to make money. I think the value value judgment for Congress with something like this is, how much do we value them making money as prime contractors? Because to me, this proposal will have the effect of driving more small businesses out of the market than enter, because some small businesses as primes, because some small businesses, if the rule of two is removed or curtailed, are going to take a look at the competition they now face, which are going to be household names, and be like, I can't beat that regularly. I don't want to. My P win is minuscule. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's a value judgment. You could say, well, if you're the government, you say, yeah, but we want the best solution. We want it more efficient. Okay. Those are value judgments that we need to make. But if we're truly interested in having a broad industrial base and and more companies that eventually can say, yeah, I can beat Amazon today, it's because they've been incubated in this small business environment. They didn't just start doing that the minute they entered the federal marketplace. So that's a value judgment policymakers are going to make. There are some other things going on out there. There are plenty of things going on out there. One that I would highlight to keep in mind for your listeners for the next couple months as this National Defense Authorization Act is going through. And the NDAA, for those who aren't as familiar with that, that's an annual package of legislation that's passed by both House and Senate that authorizes expenditures for what's Department of Defense or Department of War, however you want to call it now. I'm going to be calling it DOD for the next decade until I get used to a name change. So forgive me if you're already using the revision there, but the bill also tends to include a lot of other items that may or may not be specific to that agency, because it's a bill that is almost guaranteed to pass every year. Well, one thing that's going through on the House side, and I believe has now passed the full House, I have to double check this once they post the actual text of the passed bill, but I believe it has, would be a set-aside program at the DOD for veteran-owned small businesses, VOSBs. And if right now the VA is the only agency that has authority to issue set-aside contracts or sole source contracts for VOSBs. Those the owners don't have service disabled status. This would add DoD to that group of now be two agencies that could do it. It would give DoD a 5% goal for pushing contracts to VOSBs, and would give the DoD authority to do both set-aside contracts and sole source contracts for VOSB. So I've worked with many veterans who, of service disabled and not, and the gap between what the current contracting rules allow for SDVOSBs versus VOSBs is massive. So you can have a veteran who served his or her country honorably for decades and doesn't happen to have a service-connected disability, and they're much more limited in what they can do in the federal marketplace than someone who has that service-connected disability. So I would urge, if you're a veteran, keep an eye on that NDAA, because that program would give a real leg up to veteran-owned businesses at Department of Defense or Department of War, whatever your preferred terminology of the moment is.
Yeah, and I'm excited about that one because I'm a veteran. I am recently service connected. I've been out for over 20 years, but I'm only recently service connected, recently in the last 2 or 3 years. So I was out almost 20 years before I got my service connection. One, because I didn't know I was eligible. And two, because it is a royal pain in the ass. There's no other way to say it. To get approved for stuff. And I'm still, even though a little over 2 years ago is when I got approved initially, I'm still working on stuff. I still have cases going on that would increase my service connection. So it's not as cut and dry as just getting your service connection either, which to me is one of those things where somebody could have a very obvious disability from the military and be struggling to get their SDVOSB for years. Yeah. So that's one thing. But I've always had to break the news to veterans because they're like, well, I'm a veteran. I'm like, are you SDVSB? And they're like, no, I'm just a veteran. I'm like, yeah, that's worthless.
And I've had that experience too. And I've said, well, VA has those rules, but you're still second in line behind the SDVSBs. Yeah, and so you're kind of getting the crumbs that is left behind for that. So yeah, this program that is proposed in the House bill would put that program on parity with SDVSB, with Women-Owned, with HUBZone, with 8A. So it would be a co-equal program to those. So it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, it is. And again, I've dreaded that conversation with veterans having to say, I'm sorry that status is not helpful, but it's not right now. And even with SDVOSB, having to tell a veteran, hey, this is helpful if your target's the VA. If your target is outside the VA, it's not really helpful. So, that's been the case to a degree for a lot of folks, whereas the VA, it's like, okay, we need this because we're targeting that. But a lot of times when we start to do that breakdown I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of other statuses that were way ahead of veteran. that's just what it was. And so I'm glad to see those things, reaching that level now. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was cool to see that. That was a amendment to the base bill in the House that was passed with broad bipartisan support. So it's nice to see that even in our polarized, we talk about 50-50 times, there are things
Yeah.
that members of both parties can get behind, and supporting veterans should always be one of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Well, Stephen, it's always great to talk with you. I could talk for hours about government contracting, pickleball, and all kinds of other entrepreneurship and writing, and all kinds of different things with you. You're a pleasure to talk with. I love watching your stuff. And even though you said not to, I am going to plug, if people are not following Stephen on LinkedIn, go follow him on LinkedIn, subscribe to his newsletter on there. You will not only be educated, but also entertained. I think I always have a little chuckle every time I read your stuff. I like your slant on the way you do things. So I really appreciate it. Really appreciate
Appreciate
it.
that
Yeah.
as well. And writing. Look at all those books behind this man. Some even with a blurb by me. So these are
Yeah, there's a couple with the blurred by you.
that's right. So no,
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Yes, if you like government contracts and dad jokes, then follow me on LinkedIn.
Yeah. Or even in sync jokes. I think wasn't there like an in sync joke in that one
I've
book?
done that, and I think one of my published books in print form has a list of acronyms, and I put NKOTB back there just to see if anyone could get the new kids on the
And I
block.
did. And that's the one I'm talking about.
A few people were like, "Hey, you were reading my acronyms," and so the government, it's like, what does SBA mean? What does FAR mean? And it's like, what does NKOTB mean? It's like,
I found that one in there.
yeah.
I think I reached out to you because I was like, I know Shane didn't write that. It had to be.
That's just just a little Easter egg for people who are
Yeah.
reading the book to that level, and from a generation where that makes any sense. Because my kids are
Yeah.
like, "What's that? I don't know what
Yeah,
that
yeah.
means."
I cracked up when I saw that. I think I reached out to you about that one. It was funny. So, but anyway, thanks again. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you'll be back on soon.
Well, I appreciate you, Michael. Always wonderful talking to you.